Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the deep dive in mobilizing catalytic finance for green investments as part of AVPN's first ever South Asia Impact Capital Festival. I am Sangeeta Watson, Senior Product Associate, Knowledge and Insights at AVPN, and I'm delighted that you could be with us today. Before moving to the program proper, a few housekeeping announcements. If you have any questions for the speakers in relation to the session, we will be holding a Q&A session at the end. So do stay with us till then. Feel free to type your questions in the Q&A pod and we will convey them to our speakers. Due to time constraints, the speakers may not be able to respond to all your questions. We thank you for your understanding. To download any session resources, please click on the download icon on the agenda page beside the session title. To continue chatting with your speakers and fellow delegates in this session, please make full use of the messaging function or the event feed in the platform. Finally, please note that this session will be recorded and you will be able to access the recordings for 3 weeks after the festival. Over the course of the next 60 minutes, the panel will discuss how various stakeholders in the development finance sector have used innovative approaches to leverage philanthropic capital to attract commercial funds for enhancing green finance opportunities. The panel will also highlight bottlenecks faced by these leading organizations and the potential micro and macro solutions that can be embraced to magnify the flow of capital for sustainable investments. I would now like to introduce Mr. Karan Raj Chowdhury, Advisor, SDG and Innovative Finance from UNDP India, who will be moderating the session. Mr. Karan, we're so pleased to have you here with us today. If you could just start the session by introducing the speakers, please.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sangeeta, and ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, afternoon, and evening to friends who are joining us, I'm sure from all over South Asia and indeed from anywhere else around the globe. The United Nations Development Programme is delighted to be a festival partner for AVPN's first ever Impact Capital Festival, and we are very grateful to the AVPN team as well for their support in pulling together not just this conversation, but an entire month-long series of virtual conversations, a number of which I've been able to attend. To introduce myself, as was stated, I'm the advisor for SDG and Innovative Finance, and I work for the UNDP India office primarily, but I also support a number of other offices in the region that are working on similar initiatives. I'm absolutely delighted to be the moderator for the session today on mobilizing catalytic finance for green investments. This is an area that is incredibly important also to the UN's work and a number of the conversations that we've been having, particularly from the start of the pandemic. To just, before I introduce this fantastic panel, just to give everyone a sense of some of the work that the UNDP has been doing in this space, particularly in India, and some of the things that are, fairly top of mind. In late 2020, for example, we partnered with India's Ministry of Finance to launch the Sustainable Finance Collaborative, which focused on 6 streams of discussions, bringing together leading experts, not only from India, but from around the globe. And we're now working with the government and the newly instituted Sustainable Finance Task Force, which is also an output of the collaborative and is working on a fairly ambitious agenda on how India can really take some of these essential next steps. But also beyond financing strategies and policy support, we're also increasingly focused on trying to provide early stage technical assistance for the development of green financing instruments, particularly those that are most closely aligned to the UNDP India country office's key programmatic interventions. And I think this is an area that we're going to hear a lot more about from our panelists, who will speak to their much more substantial experience on this topic. Mobilizing catalytic finance and just green investments, as I said, is an incredibly important area, and even more so in light of the pandemic, that there can be no sustained recovery without building back a more resilient financial system that really places climate and environmental risks at its core. And while we've seen a lot of this, a lot of conversation, and we've seen a lot of action, certainly within institutions like the European Union, there is perhaps a lot more that needs to happen in the India context or in the South Asia context as a whole. But the positive news is certainly not only in India, but also governments across the region are increasingly conscious of this and are taking steps not only to engage in dialogue, but also ideating and laying out actionable steps that could be followed. As part of the conversation today, we are hoping to engage not just on the barriers to scale financing opportunities, but also the solutions, also what can really be done in India. What is it that we have to learn? What has worked in other jurisdictions that could perhaps be replicated here and scaled here? We are, certainly in the India context, it's a unique country with its own sets of challenges and regulations where we talk about blended finance. The system here in India is, very skewed to perhaps preventing the intermixing of different forms of capital. So not everything is as easy or as straightforward as perhaps it is in some other places. We have just a little under an hour or so. I have a few questions for each of our 4 panelists, and I'm going to try my best as well to take up as many questions from the audience. But before we move into the discussion, let me just take a couple of minutes to introduce this great lineup of speakers. We have Augustin, and Augustin is in charge of the energy and finance sector for the French Development Agency in India. He has also operational and managerial responsibilities to promote renewable energy and energy efficiency solutions. I've also, met Augustin a couple of years ago, so it's great. It's great to see him here again. We have Mike from the Rockefeller Foundation, and Mike leads the foundation's PRI work, which consists of growing a portfolio of investments that support the overarching philanthropic goals of the foundation. And Mike was also previously at USAID, which is also a fairly active player here in India when it comes to their guarantee portfolio and so on. They weren't on climate for the last 4 years for obvious reasons, but are certainly back in the game now. We have John, who is joining us, and it's 5:30 in the morning. So thank you, John, for taking the time. John is a director and leads the work on impact investing for the John and Catherine MacArthur Foundation. And he's also a member of the Climate Solutions Initiative. So it's great to have John join us. And finally, we have Smitha. Smitha is an economist, a chartered accountant, and a sustainable development specialist. She's currently the gender and inclusion lead for the FTCO-funded ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program, which is focused on promoting inclusive economic growth in Southeast Asia. So this is a fantastic lineup, and I'm very excited to get this conversation started. So, maybe I'll start, Augustin, with you, and just for the DFI perspective to begin with, if you could share a little bit more around AFD's strategy around green investments in India and how this portfolio has evolved over time. And I think, as you talk about it as well, if you could also talk about, have you seen certain innovations that the government is perhaps now more comfortable with? I heard just a few days ago of an interesting discussion, and I think that was AFD-centric on outcomes-based financing for green or climate projects at the municipal level, and a conversation that's ongoing there. So over to you, Augustin.
Great, thank you very much. So I hope I'm audible and everything is working well. First, thank you very much for the invitation and for giving me this opportunity to be part of this panel discussion. It's really my pleasure to be here this afternoon. So thank you for that. So going back to your question about AFD, so the French Agency for Development. In few words, AFD is the French bilateral public development bank. AFD has a presence in more than 100 countries in the world, and finances projects directly contributing to the commitment of the French government toward the Sustainable Development Goals. Quite interestingly, the climate plan published by the French government in 2017 gives AFD a very specific role and mandate in the fight against climate change. So in that context, AFD became the first bilateral development bank with an explicit mandate to implement the Paris Agreement and its goals of keeping climate change below the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. So to do so, AFD promotes climate change mitigation projects. So of course, projects that will directly reduces the release of greenhouse gas emission, as well as climate change adaptation projects that will strengthen the resilience of economies and population. So AFD is a partner of India since 2008. And so we work directly with the Indian authorities to promote green and inclusive growth. So we operate through a mix of different financial products. Of course, the main one is the long-term soft loan that AFD will provide to the central government or to state government or public enterprises and financial institutions. We also provide grants coming from our directly the resources from the French government, or the resources could come from the European Union, and we also have access to the Green Climate Fund for this kind of grant financial instrument. So the grants, we use them as either as a blending tool that will be going along with the long-term financing from AFD, or we can use the grant as a resources to provide technical assistance and capacity building program. So over the last 12 years of activity in India, AFD has invested in more than 2 billion euros projects. And AFD strategy in India is broken down in 3 main objectives. The first objective is really to support sustainable urban development in India. So AFD has financed several metro projects, the Bangalore Metro Project, the Kochi Metro Project, Nagpur and Pune Metro Project. We have also several projects in the water, sanitation and solid waste management. So that's for the first matrix. The second operational objective for AFD in India is really to contribute and accelerate the energy transition of the country through the promotion of renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. And for that, we work with public sector undertaking in India, like ESL, IREDA, SIDBI, and NHB. And then the last metrics, I would say, is to preserve and sustainably manage natural resources. And for example, we work in the Assam state with the forest department for reforestation and preservation of biodiversity. So that's, in a nutshell, the activity of AFD in India. I can give you more details about the activity if necessary, but I think I will stop here for the introduction, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Augustine. I think that's $2 billion, 12 years, a lot of work on metros. Which is great as India makes this transition to sustainable transport and also just enhancing public transportation in the country. Just very quickly, Augustine, on do you see metros have been such a large focus for you in terms of urban and sustainable development? Do you see new areas or new green pathways emerging there as you try and broaden that portfolio as well?
So yeah, the urban development is roughly 50% of our portfolio today. And of course, we will keep focusing on that sectors because sustainable development in the cities is of course one of the bigger challenge for India. No, having said that, of course, we are focused on other tech sectors. And today, actually, we are trying to focus more and more on adaptation projects, like resilience, how to increase resilience. We have projects with the World Bank in the Kerala state about how to improve the resilience in the states. Same for the Himachal Pradesh. We have, so of course, no, we are well known in India for our metro project. That is true. I think it's only 50% of our activity, and today we are really trying, for example, in the energy sectors, trying to focus more on, I would say, innovative technologies. We are in discussion, to promote what now we call floating solar projects. We believe there is a huge potential for this kind of technologies in India. So as a development agency, we try not to finance the existing project, but try to see a bit further what is the future of the market. And this kind of technology, as I mentioned, floating solar, I think this represents quite well what we try to achieve in India.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Augustine. Mike, on just in terms of the Rockefeller Foundation and the fact that you also made a very substantial $1 billion commitment around a more inclusive and green recovery from COVID-19. So how is that going? What do you really see as the role of green finance and green investments in the recovery? And so where do you see that going?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks so much, Karen, and thanks to the AVPN and UNDP for including the foundation this morning or this afternoon, where you may be. So look, I think from the foundation's perspective, first off, is you obviously can't have a green recovery until you have kind of a successful COVID response. And so the foundation is plowing lots of resources, as lots of different organizations are, into ensuring that first and foremost, we effectively deal with the virus. And I think in lots of parts of the world, that, especially here in the US, that's still very much a work in progress. And one of the reasons why, at least personally from a policy perspective, I think it's so important to link COVID and climate is because COVID is a funding conduit, if you will, if I'm being candid, to get more resources for the climate and kind of environmental objectives that we all seek to achieve. And so I think there's benefit to linking these two things logically and also from a policy perspective. Karen, you mentioned that the US has just decided to reemerge into the climate conversation after a brief hiatus, which we're all obviously very excited about. And frankly, conversations here internally with folks at Treasury or some of our colleagues in the administration are very much focused on linking these two pieces and finding ways to pivot off of a successful COVID response into a global, green, inclusive, all the different buzzwords, recovery that we're all hopeful for. And so I think you're right to link those two kind of incredibly immense challenges that we're all facing. I think from the foundation's perspective, you mentioned the $1 billion commitment. Thankfully, it's not my commitment, it's on behalf of the foundation. We, along with John at the MacArthur Foundation, a few other US-based foundations, have gone to the capital markets recently to raise capital to expand our spending in this immense moment of need. And so for Rockefeller, that was a $700 million bond issuance that we issued late last year, just to augment our funding for the next few years, recognizing that there's such an opportunity to really move the needle on some of these big challenges, and wanting to basically, in the case of Rockefeller, double or triple our spend over the next 2 to 3 years. So it's quite a substantial commitment from our side. Our kind of clean renewable energy program is intended to be about half of that $1 billion. And so again, for a relatively small institution like ours, it's a very big commitment. I would say in the India and in the Asian context, our work in renewable energy to date has really focused on off-grid energy access. And so what that has meant for us primarily has been mini grids. And we started a program in India 5 or 6 years ago called Smart Power India, which remains today, and from our perspective is really kind of the leading technical hub in the country for mini grid energy access related issues. And anyone who's been active in the mini grid space knows that it's a tough business model to crack and to make financially viable. And so we provide all sorts of technical assistance to mini grid developers. everything from site selection, demand stimulation to make sure once you build the grid, you're actually building revenue. Yes, investment capital from my team, where we're investing in these developers as they go to market and start to scale. But what's really interesting is our learning from the Smart Power India program has basically formed the foundation for this broader $500 million commitment that we've made to the space, and basically taking the SPI model and blowing it out globally, and now really extrapolating those learnings into Africa. We have a similar program in Myanmar, and really trying to say, if energy access is obviously such a critical component of development writ large, how do we ensure that we're not just providing the technical assistance to developers and the working capital needed to developers to actually build grids, but what are some of the policy interventions that we can support? What are some of the subsidy programs that we can model in different markets and extrapolate to other countries? And so that's led to what we're calling currently, but it's still under development, a portfolio called Smart Power Global, which again is intended to be a more all-encompassing approach to off-grid energy access that includes kind of public interventions and private interventions, which yes includes investments from our side, and really trying to take a more holistic approach to the space. And for us, that isn't just going to mean energy access anymore. It's going to be energy access plus grid reliability. In a country like India, but frankly, in lots of markets, you have grid reliability issues, which, in a country like India, you have 100% electrification as per the government, but we know that power is intermittent. It's not necessarily affordable, and it's just not reliable, whether you're a household or a small business trying to make a living. And so we think there's a real opportunity to supplement what utilities are doing with different energy access technologies, mini grids being at the fore, but there's all sorts of different innovation happening in this space. And so I think from our perspective, we're really excited about the work that we've done in the region and kind of growing that beyond India. But we're really using India as a kind of our core base going forward.
No, thank you, Mike. And I think everyone has, and at least I have heard a lot about the mini grid program that Rockefeller was supporting, and and all the learnings that came from it. Completely agree. It's a very tough, if not impossible, sort of model to from a commercial lens, and I've seen that and heard a lot about it as well. But great to see that those learnings are translating and also being replicated in other countries as well. So. And there continues to be so much that needs to be done in India around grid reliability and access, and so on. So, John, just coming to you, and the MacArthur Foundation has so many different modalities and instruments of engagement. So I'm just wondering if you can give us a sense of what are the different approaches that you use when you look at green investments, and how's that going?
Sure, thanks, Karan. And maybe I'll just start by also thanking AVPN and UNDP for including MacArthur as part of this discussion. We have really just such a high level of respect for both organizations and their leadership. So it's a real privilege to be part of this panel discussion today. For those of you who don't know, MacArthur, like Mike's organization, the Rockefeller Foundation, MacArthur is a U.S. private foundation. We're based in Chicago in the United States, and we've been actively engaged in pursuing efforts to support climate change mitigation since 2015. And I'll just make one quick correction. I'm proud to serve as a director on the impact investments team at MacArthur under Deborah Schwartz's leadership, who's our managing director for that program. And Karan, I'll try to answer your question a little more broadly and touch on maybe three key levers that MacArthur seeks to pursue when we're looking at support in this area. So the first is we have a traditional grant making program that's built around a specific theory of change. And for climate solutions, our theory of change is focused on supporting the domestic ambition of both the US and India, while also attempting to center our efforts on equity in both regions. And since 2015, we've made more than 300 million in grants across a range of activities that seek to support the transition to a low carbon economy. So that was the first lever. The second lever that we look to pursue is our grants that can play an important role in stimulating and supporting private sector activity. And just some examples of this include technical assistance, project preparation, and the development of tools that can be utilized by the private sector. And then a fourth example that I'll just mention here is design funding. And this is something that Mike and his team are quite adept at the Rockefeller Foundation. But just an example of an effort that we pursued here is where we are, along with our partners at Convergence, which is just a terrific leading blended finance organization. Together, we provided design funding to support the development of the Climate Finance Partnership, which is a $500 million BlackRock managed blended finance facility that's investing in sustainable infrastructure in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And that facility is powered by catalytic capital. And I should just note that the government of France was a key proponent of this and did contribute significantly to the catalytic capital component of that facility to make that work. And then the last area of support or the last lever, I should say, of support that we seek to pursue is through impact investments. And at MacArthur, we seek to make catalytic capital impact investments. And by that, we mean capital that's willing to take disproportionate risk and or seek a concession of some kind in order to generate a specific form of impact. And what we see is that catalytic capital tends to take two principal forms when it's deployed. One is in some sort of an all catalytic capital facility. And then the second is, like the Climate Finance Partnership, is a blended finance structure of some kind where catalytic capital will then blend in a capital stack with more commercially oriented, more conventional forms of capital. And two examples, one of each, where we've deployed MacArthur capital for an all catalytic capital example. We supported the Prime Impact Fund, which is a purpose-built structure that's supporting the commercialization of early stage technology ventures, specifically for more capital intensive, hard technology and climate relevant technologies. And then a second example in the blended finance realm was our support along with the Packard Foundation for Terra Silva investments. And here we and Packard provided catalytic debt that blended with an equity partner to enable support for a small group of emerging fund managers that are pursuing sustainable land use in and around tropical forests. And maybe the last thing I'll note here before I stop is that we're really proud to be the sole equity investor in the Zero Gap Fund that is managed by Mike and his innovative finance colleagues at the Rockefeller Foundation, and which we believe will have a really significant impact on climate resilience in a variety of ways. And we think, I mentioned this because we think this represents a really important point more broadly, that just given the scale of the climate resilience challenge, we need to find ways to support and stand behind the leadership of others like Mike and his team wherever appropriate. And so I think I'll just stop there and happy to talk more about our work specifically in India as well.
No, thank you, John, and I know Mike was quite pleased at the end of your comments there as well, and of course, well deserved. But no, but it's great to see, John, the the different forms that of support that the MacArthur Foundation is providing. And I think catalytic is sort of the buzzword that comes out of it when you talk about technical assistance, you talk about project preparation, you talk about design funding, and I know that we've had a few conversations on this because at least from the UNDP lens, we see that as a particular sort of pain point in the India context, and not so much with private investors and private institutions, though I'm sure the need exists there as well if we look and if we ask. But certainly when we look at government agencies and departments and government-led institutions, the fact that they certainly require some of that early stage technical assistance or design funding sort of support to make a concept a little bit more real for them, whether it's a municipality or it's they're working within a state government. And I think that is the point at which government is not really able to procure services and so on, because they don't have enough of a handle. It hasn't been made real yet. And there is certainly an opportunity there for this sort of support. So really great to see that whole portfolio at the MacArthur Foundation. Smitha, saving the best for last. As we talk about sustainable finance, as we talk about, green recovery, there's a lot about, how do we place gender here, and how is it that, this gender lens is not something that is just referenced and not just a tick box, but if you could just talk to us a little bit about perhaps the climate gender nexus, and and also then just beyond the moral imperative, what really is the business case for accounting for this?
Sure. Thanks very much, Karan. And thank you also to AVPN and the UNDP for inviting me as well to this panel. So before I answer the specific question, I just wanted to share a bit of background on the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program that I'm the Gender and Inclusion Lead for, and our journey in terms of integrating climate and gender investing. The LCP is a technical assistance program funded by the UK's Prosperity Fund, and one of its key aims is to increase sustainable finance flows to support a low carbon energy transition in the ASEAN region by measuring and disclosing climate-related financial risks, raising and steering green finance, amongst many other activities. And gender and inclusion is a cross-cutting theme mainstreamed throughout the program to ensure a just transition. So when we first began to build the case for a gender climate finance nexus last year, we realized that applying a climate lens to businesses and investments was easily understood, as it forms a central pillar of ESG reporting. And many of you referred to that. Also, gender equality was receiving a lot of attention as a result of corporate diversity disclosure requirements. But gender lens investing was a newer piece of the landscape. So what do we mean by that, right? Before we get onto the gender climate nexus, what we mean, gender lens investing means intentionally incorporating gender considerations into financial analysis to achieve better financial and social outcomes. It has the potential to deliver for business, women, and the planet. It's not just about empowering women at a surface level, nor is it another screen to add to a list of already loads of disclosure requirements. Rather, it's a way of rethinking what we value as we invest, who is at the investment table, and as an investor, and to bring about really a systems level change. So, as you said, Karan, going beyond the social justice argument, what did we find to build the business case? We collected evidence globally to build this. So evidence from a study by Berkeley University shows that women in leadership are more likely to proactively improve energy efficiency, invest in renewable energies, and measure and reduce their carbon emissions. At the macro level, McKinsey estimates that up to $28 trillion or 26% could be added to the global GDP in 2025 by closing the representation gap between men and women in the economy. And this is even more urgent than ever, with so many women now dropping out of the workforce thanks to the pandemic. Another reason to mainstream gender considerations in sustainable investing is that companies with a gender diverse workforce are likely to outperform their peers. A recent research covering more than 1,000 companies worldwide found that companies with gender diverse boards are 28% more likely to outperform their peers. And similarly, venture and private equity funds with gender balanced teams have 20% higher returns than their peers. And the effect of leadership actually goes beyond financial returns. A recent analysis by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Japan of more than 11,700 companies globally found that a critical mass of 30% of women on a company's board made a difference to climate governance and innovation, and a lower growth rate of emissions of 0.6% compared to 3.5% for companies with no women on their board. And I know that this audience will be familiar with many emerging success stories of supporting female entrepreneurs leading on delivering climate solutions in India. For example, Frontier Markets, a provider of off-grid solar power solutions in rural India, increased their supplies by 30% after the company began to employ female entrepreneurs as their suppliers and sales agents. So involving women has improved the company's reach and their profitability, and helped to bring clean energy into homes that previously had no electricity in rural India. A high gender score can also signal to investors that the company manages its risk well. And risk is, of course, of key consideration for any kind of financing. And indeed, several studies show that companies with good gender performance have higher market valuations compared to their peers. And finally, nowadays, companies without strong gender values are finding it increasingly difficult to recruit the best talent from a much more values-driven workforce who want to see that in the company that they want to work for, even if that company is operating in the climate space. So, we found that all of these are reasons for building up that case for why intentionally, and that's the critical word, intentionally integrating gender and climate investing is not only the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do, and especially in the context of building back better after the pandemic.
Thank you, Smita. I think that I think it absolutely resonates with everyone, and I know that it is an increasing number of conversations focus on it, and certainly even when UNDP is in conversation with potential partners and others, we've always insisted on gender being not just a tick box at the end of a project document, but really something that is fairly centric and something that's accounted for. So I think that is happening a lot more here in the India context. And, it's interesting you mentioned Frontier Markets there as an example as well. Just a few months ago, we did a webinar with Frontier Markets, with Renew Power, and others, just talking specifically on women in climate entrepreneurship and what is it that we can do to try and promote that sort of nexus and that confluence there. So great points there. And surprisingly, we are a little bit behind schedule, as I'm just keeping an eye on the watch here. So going to move through the next round a little bit quicker, but I'm also going to try and bring in some of the questions from the audience that are here with me. So I might put more than one question to panelists as part of this round. So Augustine, just very quickly, your reflections on, if you were to try and name three, top three sort of barriers to scaling green investments in India, what do you think? What do you think those barriers would be? And ideally, barriers that we can deal with and try and find solutions to.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I like this idea of linking the barriers with the solution, because if we just put the challenges and the difficulties we are facing here, it's a bit empty. I'll just take 1 minute before answering that to really try to see what are we talking about when we discuss about financing, like reducing the financing gap for climate and green investment in India. So we know that the NDC, the National Determinate Contribution for India, so really rapidly, but reducing the emission intensity of GDP and increasing the share of non-fossil fuel source in the electric capacity sector. just to achieve those two targets by 2030, there's a rough estimation that India has to invest 200 billion US dollar each year for the next 10 years for this energy and ecological transition. And last year, and this is where it becomes difficult, because even the figures, we are not so sure about what is it that we call green finance. And this is part of the problem. But we believe that last year in India, it's roughly 20 billion US dollar of green finance mobilized in India. So that represents roughly, I would say, 10% of the green investment needs for India to meet the NDC target. We have to be cautious with the figures because, as I said, it's difficult to have a precise idea. But I think this 10% is something that we should keep in mind. So the question, as you said, is how do we bridge the 90% gap? I think the first answer is really to develop a transparent framework for green finance market and project. Clearly today in India, there is a lack of accepted definition of what green means in terms of asset classes and sectors. In the bond market, for example, there is the absence of a detailed green taxonomy creates a risk for investors. Because if bond issuers define what is green by themselves, there is a risk that the definition might not be accepted by international investors. So first, developing a widely accepted set of robust green standard is actually very important to ensure confidence in the functioning of the green financial market. Also, I believe that there is appetite among investors to channel funding to green projects in India and other countries. But there is a lack of diversified and credible pipeline of green projects. And that makes it very difficult to mobilize finance. So focusing on really developing a solid portfolio of projects. And I think for that, it may require policy and regulatory intervention, could also play a very important role in mobilizing capital. Maybe the second idea is really to try to work on developing new financing mechanism adapted to the needs of the Indian transition. For example, in India, we discussed about that, but there is a huge investment needs and therefore opportunities in investing in sustainable urban infrastructure in India. So for example, the Indian government could create some specific attractive investment vehicle for investors, or to take specific measures to strengthen the municipal bond market to help cities to directly get access to their infrastructure needs. And maybe the last idea, and it's quite specific to India, but Indian state-owned actors today, like development banks, commercial banks, and public enterprises, they are already playing a very important role in mobilizing green capital flows in India. And I think this is kind of a particularity of India as compared to other countries. So the government could work with these institutions to put in place more proactive green development policies by adjusting the mandate of those institutions and try to encouraging the participation of private sectors. So maybe three ideas. One is to develop a transparent framework for green finance products. Second is to develop innovative financing mechanism to address the potential of the specific green markets in India. And the last one is public sectors, work with the public sectors entities to implement new green development policies and to enhance private sector's participation.
Right. Thank you, Augustine. I think that's very comprehensive, and certainly, a number of these points also came out at the collaborative last year with the Ministry of Finance, and one of the things that is very much top of mind, and I think something the government is now working on, is the development of a taxonomy. And that becomes so important in India's case, particularly as a recipient of foreign direct investment, to ensure that there's also a level of harmonization with the standards that have emerged or the classifications that have emerged in other jurisdictions. So I think that's great. So thank you for that input. Mike, I think, just perhaps two questions. One was, just around how do you see, partnerships and collaborations with multilateral agencies, donor agencies around green investments, and what has been Rockefeller's experience of that? And the second is just on, how can innovations in finance and technology really be leveraged for green investments? And this is a question from the audience.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Karen. And so I think first and foremost on the partnership point, for an institution like ours, partnership is absolutely everything. And our ability to work together to unlock investment opportunities, to create new structures, to work with government for the policy and enabling environment changes and obviously mobilizing the private sector is obviously crucial across the board. And so for us, being able to partner with institutions like the MacArthur Foundation, like AFD, is critical to achieving our mutual objectives. And the type of funding that a foundation like Rockefeller has, its flexibility, we can do grants, we can do a whole range of different investments, from debt, equity, guarantees. We can be subordinate, we can be concessional, we can plug in wherever we need to in these different projects. And it's the flexibility of that catalytic funding that we have that really makes our funding potent and frankly able to crowd in others into different projects. It doesn't always work that way in practice, as we all know, and it can be difficult to, especially in a space like energy access, like I discussed previously, to find a way to bring all these different partners together into these transactions. But I think there's plenty of examples where it's been successful. I mean, even in the off-grid space, so a company like OMC, which is a mini grid developer in India that we've invested in for the last 4 or 5 years now. Mitsui has come in and is now the largest kind of non-management shareholder of that company, and is bringing kind of their institutional know-how and capacity to the table to help scale up that business and move it towards a point of sustainability. And so I think it's absolutely crucial that those partnerships form the foundation of a broader kind of green investment strategy for the region. I think we also, however, have to recognize kind of the limitations of our different institutions and what we can and can't do. One of the big things that we've been focused on is how do you link the energy access argument to the broader climate finance discussion, recognizing that there's lots of funding in the climate finance space that doesn't necessarily make the connection to energy access for obvious reasons. Like energy access isn't a big emitter, if you will, of CO2. However, as those individuals and communities come online and start consuming power, making sure that power is green, is renewable, and all of the things that we're all focused on is obviously important. And so that's just one opportunity, frankly, for us to engage multilaterals and donors in a different kind of way than we've done to date. And so I think it's just an absolutely crucial part of the puzzle here. In regards to technology and being able to support new innovative structures kind of in the green investment space, with our partners at MacArthur on the Zero Gap Fund that you referenced, the whole theme of the fund, right, is around incubating new financial products and structures and mechanisms. So really getting at the mechanism, less so the actual manager or the sector, but what is the mechanism that we're supporting and developing? And this goes off Augustine's point, that can mobilize kind of private capital at scale for issues like climate change and resilience and adaptation. Is at the core. And so an example of a portfolio company in that fund, just as an example, is the Lightsmith Group, which some of you may know has a fund called CRAFT, which I won't attempt the acronym, but it's all around investing in climate resilience and adaptation technologies that are kind of prevalent in the developed world that can be extrapolated through a somewhat traditional tech transfer model into the global south, into some of these markets where this technology and this level of expertise is desperately needed, but isn't always readily available. And so if you think about different catastrophe modeling scenarios, different seed drought-resistant crop companies, they're all growth stage companies, and so it's a pretty straightforward growth stage business. But taking those companies into these markets where they can add a ton of value, especially in a space like adaptation, which we know is kind of drastically underinvested compared to resilience, which I think was another question in the chat. And so look, the opportunity is out there. I think it's going to take partnership, as we said, to really get them across the finish line. And I think we stand ready to engage with all of you on the call to find ways to get these projects across the finish line.
Thank you, Mike. That was great. And in India, at least, I feel like a lot of the conversations these days focus on the fact that, yes, while we are trying to work on blended finance, we often are in a situation where there is very limited philanthropic capital that can make its way as part of a capital structure or really play that sort of catalytic role. Not because it's, well, A1, when it comes to local institutions, it's not really available. And when it comes to a lot of the international institutions, it is difficult for them to participate in these sorts of capital structures due to existing regulations and so on. So just very quickly to John, and I've got a 10-minute warning here. Very quickly to John as well on how do we look at scaling green investments here in India, and are there any specific perhaps lessons of blending or any other from the work that MacArthur has been doing in other countries that are very applicable here in India and you'd like to see taking off?
Sure, thanks, Karan, and I'll try to be brief in my response here, given the time constraints. And maybe just to build off another question in the chat, which is there's a concern that capital's circling around just a few areas, and I think one way to think about that and to address that is not to start with the problem itself, and this gets to what Augustine was saying earlier as well, is starting with the problem, building from that problem, and designing solutions around the problem. And that tends to be the way that we think about this. And it isn't sort of where are the most investable opportunities. It's sort of oddly and paradoxically, it's the reverse. We want to start with where are the challenges, where are the capital gaps, and design solutions around those. And maybe and that does require, as Mike was saying, sort of a full continuum of capital to address those areas. And just to give you a quick example of some work that we've done in India in particular that takes this approach. So back in 2016, we collaborated with a small consortium of philanthropic partners, along with the government of India and the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, or the USDFC, with the goal of addressing some key investment barriers in the off-grid and rooftop solar markets. And we decided to focus on rooftop in particular because it represented a capital gap that was essential to India's NDC Paris NDC under the Paris Accord. And our assessment of this was that again, capital was flowing pretty effectively at that time, and still is, at the utility scale and at large scale commercial. But as you start to go down market in the MSME sector, it's blocked for a variety of reasons. And this is a really potentially systemic area of support, because if you can unlock this segment represents 25 to 30% of power consumption in India. So really, we looked at this as an area to focus our support. And to do that, we identified three key areas of interventions. The first was, and again, this gets back to what Augustine was saying about pipeline development. So we looked to design and launch a project preparation facility, which we launched in 2017, called the U.S. India Clean Energy Finance Facility. And this is again a partnership with the USDFC and the government of India, and it provides grants to investment grade projects to increase their prospects of obtaining long-term debt financing. And to date, that effort has mobilized new debt of over 200 million for 18 different early stage businesses, and helped to facilitate over 500 megawatts of installed solar capacity. So that was the first intervention. The second was we sought to deploy our own capital, and that was targeted around support for non-banking financial companies in India, or NBFCs, And in this way, we supported the launch of a purpose-built NBFC that was focused on distributed renewable energy generation. And then we also supported the launch of a fund called Encourage Solar Finance that was seeking to enable existing NBFCs to promote solar financing through their established client relationships. And then the last area of support was grants to support credit enhancement and technical assistance. And on the credit enhancement side, we provided grants to both help design credit enhancement structures and then implement them. One of these has been picked up by the USDFC and another is under consideration with another potential partner. And then we provided grants for capacity building and technical assistance. So all told, these efforts allowed for a full continuum of support, moving from building pipeline for earlier stage opportunities to facilitating actual transactions on the ground for middle stage efforts, and then ultimately, hopefully, providing some tools and incentives for engagement at a larger scale with a broader set of actors within the Indian financial system at a later stage. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that gives you some context for that work.
Thank you, John. No, that's great, and it's such an immense amount of work, and there's certainly some initiatives there that I've heard of that I actually did not realize MacArthur was part of some of those alliances. So that's really great to know. And so Smitha, on what is the wish list or the vision for India when it comes to green finance and mainstreaming gender as part of that conversation?
Sure. I think just a couple of lines on the how we do this, right? Because we talked about the why we have to do it. Before I get onto the vision, I do think it's important to say that this is a nascent area. There is no single right way to approaching investing with an integrated gender and climate lens. But the main message is we need to bring down the silos and we need to intentionally think about how to integrate. And I just, before we get on to, again, the vision, there are going to be challenges, right? We're talking about sustainable finance instruments. How do we have non-gender focused sustainable finance instruments that also integrate gender indicators? And that is the question. That is the research question. There will be lots of things, challenges that we're going to face. How would the introduction of an additional layer of sustainability indicators impact the transaction costs and the general willingness of issuers to use these types of sustainable finance instruments? Are the necessary data sets, gender data sets even available? What we are finding is that if you talk about any sustainable finance instrument and develop an approach where you bring in a gender lens across all bond types, for example, not just into gender and social bonds, but also into green bonds, into transition bonds, that's where you can make the real difference. So if that is the, I guess, the foundation of the ambition. So the 5-year vision then goes beyond India and extends to seeing a real system change then in global green finance flows. There's an exponential growth, right, of sustainable investing, which offers a huge opportunity to advance gender equality. And of course, gender equality and global climate change are the two biggest existential risks that we face. So globally, assets under management with an ESG mandate are expected to reach $160 trillion by 2036, which would mean the adoption of sustainable investing across the whole asset management industry. And that is the size of the opportunity to scale up financing for gender diversity if gender indicators were to be integrated in all sustainable finance instruments and investment funds. And this becomes then business as usual. And that is my vision. Thank you,
Smitha. And I think that's great to hear. And I think hopefully we will get there. I think there is so much more pressure, specifically from the providers of capital, if you will, certainly in the West, around integrating climate and integrating environment, but also gender as part of these conversations and as part of their allocations. I think that, a number of us don't appreciate perhaps the impact that has downstream. Certainly there's a lot more that needs to be done, but if the Norwegian fund pension fund says, we are only looking at now supporting investments that have a strong environmental lens and so on. They come in and play so many different roles, not only in direct investments, but in a fund of funds capacity and so on, that influence is really permeated downstream in a lot of investing activities. So I just want to take a minute to thank everyone, Mike, John, for doing this early in the morning. Augustine, thank you for joining us as well, and Smitha for really bringing that great gender perspective. I thought this was a fantastic discussion. I thought 60 minutes would be enough. It clearly wasn't, because we could carry on certainly a bit longer. But I think we covered a lot here. We learned about the priorities of the different organizations. We learned a lot more about the exposure in your portfolios here in India, about some of the learnings in other countries, and also, interestingly, about collaborations between different stakeholders and a number of you that are part of this conversation today. So I hope that this is the first of many, and I look forward to other stimulating conversations as well as part of this AVPN Impact Festival. Sangeeta, I'm just going to hand over to you, I think, if there's some additional wrap up from AVPN side.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karan, and thank you to all the speakers. We have now come to the end of the deep dive session. This session is made possible with the kind support of our, just a minute, with the kind support of our festival partners, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Sesame Workshop India, the Rockefeller Foundation, #COVID Action Collab, VNV Advisory Services LLP, the British Asian Trust, WPP India CSR Foundation, Catalyst Management Services Private Limited, and Sattva. To continue chatting with your speakers and fellow delegates in this session, please make full use of the messaging and meeting function of our festival platform. Do share your highlights from this session on social media, and remember to tag us using the hashtag AVPN South Asia 2021 and #social impact. Up next, the session on improving access to affordable healthcare through critical investments will be starting at 6:10 p.m. India Standard Time. Thank you, and please enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.